Good evening. I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I am the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this semester's Holtzbrink lecture entitled When Love Was Forbidden, Sex and Intimacy in Iran's Revolutionary Generation. This semester's Holtzbrink Fellow is Naghmeh Sohrabi, who I'm delighted to say is actually here in residence at the Academy. Her fellowship was established originally in 1999 with the generous support of the Georg von Holtzbrink Publishing Group. And I believe that the CEO of the Holtzbrink Publishing Group is in our audience tonight, Stefan von Holtzbrink, who is the vice chairman of our board and a strong supporter of the Academy, and I want to welcome him. Over the years, this fellowship has made it possible for more than 35 outstanding scholars, writers, journalists to come for a residency in Berlin. Among them, Alex Ross, Hilton Als, Jonathan Safran Foer, George Packer, and most recently, Mosi Secret. My role tonight is to introduce the introducer. So let me begin my introduction of Behrooz Gamari Tabrizi, who will introduce in turn Naghmeh, and who will be in discussion with her and then moderate the question and answer. Behrooz Gamari Tabrizi is professor of Near Eastern Studies and director of the Sharman and Bijan Mossavar Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. Before joining Princeton's faculty a couple of years ago, Professor Gamari Tabrizi spent 14 years teaching history and sociology at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, where he also directed that university's Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. He has written extensively on topics of social theory and Islamist political thought in journals and anthologies, and is an expert on the Iranian Revolution and its aftermath, having published 3 books that look at the subject from different angles. Islam and Dissent in Post-Revolutionary Iran, Abdul Karim Sarouche and the Religious Foundations of Political Reform was published by Paul Gray Macmillan in 2008. Foucault in Iran, Islamic Revolution After the Enlightenment was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2016. And Remembering Akbar, Inside the Iranian Revolution, which was published by OR Books in 2016. In Remembering Akbar, Professor Gamari Tabrizi contemplates his own experience as a leftist student activist prior to and immediately following the Iranian Revolution. That experience culminated for him in 3 years spent on death row in the early 1980s in Tehran's infamous Evin prison. Professor Gamari Tabrizi is also no stranger to Berlin. During the 2010 and 2011 academic year, he was a fellow at the Wissenschaftskolleg, where he researched trauma among Iranian veterans of the Iran-Iraq War. Currently, he's working on a project on mystic modernity, a comparative study of the philosophy of history and political theory of Walter Benjamin and Ali Shariati. Let me just say now, before I hand it over to Behrooz, that we are looking forward to a vigorous question and answer session, but I just want to explain to you, don't press anything that suggests you can put your hand up. Instead, please go to the Q&A and you can start whenever you want and place your question there. And Behrooz will do his very best to get to as many questions as he possibly can. And with that, Behrooz, the virtual platform is yours.
Thank you so much for this kind introduction. And it's a tremendous pleasure for me to introduce my good friend and brilliant colleague, Naghmeh Sohrabi. Naghmeh is Charles Corky Goodman Associate Professor of Middle East History in the History Department at Brandeis University, where she also directs Crown Center for Middle East Studies. She has recently taken up the mantle of the president of Association for Iranian Studies. I use the mantle there to make a not so subtle reference to one of her mentors there. She got her PhD from a university located in Cambridge called Harvard. And she is the author of Taken for Wonder, 19th Century Travel Literature from Iran to Europe, which was published in 2012 by Oxford University Press. And I'm happy also to report that the book has been translated into Persian and is published by Nashr Markaz in Tehran. This evening's conversation is about, it's a page from her book in progress, tentatively titled The Intimate Lives of a Revolution, Iran, 1979. Here I would like to say a few words about Professor Sohrabi, as she's known to her friends as Naghmeh, work by recalling an observation by Mr. Mansour, my 10th grade geography teacher at Tehran's high school, Khwarazmi High School. This was ancient times. Mr. Mansour once told us, a group of eager and very ambitious young students, that there is a major difference between the way Iranians and Westerners know things. Iranians' knowledge is like an ocean less than 1 foot deep. Westerners' knowledge is like a well with an invisible button. Our knowledge has breadth without depth. There's depth without breadth. Well, obviously, Mr. Mansour had not met Naghmeh to learn the fallacy of his Orientalist binary. Since the very first time I encountered Naghmeh's scholarship, I have always been in awe of how creative she has been consistently in her ways of thinking about history, and in raising quote unquote obvious questions with foundational consequences in the field of her scholarship. How deep her knowledge of the topic that she investigates is, and how capable she is in situating that topic in its relevant field masterfully and with ease. Now, his first book, Taken for Wonder, is a prime example of her ability to delve deeply into archival material, some obscure and some already examined, and with the purpose of conceptual interventions with significance outside her primary field. By revisiting a selected 19th century travel logs, she advances a new historiography of modern Iran outside the conventional teleological history of transition to modernity. For much of the scholarship on the long 19th century in Iran, the Qajar dynasty has been understood as a period of transition from the collapse of Safavids to the rise of constitutional revolution of 1905-06. In this frame, intellectual movements, political realignments, institutional reforms, social protests, and cultural transformations in Iran are all understood as different elements of a historical change that culminated in the establishment of constitutional monarchy as a project to import from political and bureaucratic organizations, European ones, to the country. Although Sohrabi's critique of, let me just mention this word too. Earlier works has always identified the evidence for this outward-looking perception in the rise of number of Iranian travelers abroad and documenting these travels in extensive number of travel logs. This Whiggish history, Sohrabi shows convincingly, has rendered the traveler's writing irrelevant while making the travel itself the main point of encounter, amazement, and amusement. Although Sohrabi's critique of teleological history is well articulated in her first book, it is in the current project on the Iranian Revolution of 1979 that we see an instance of that critique through a thorough historical ethnography. Naghmeh's scholarship treads on controversial terrains. In general, modern history of Iran and the Middle East in general is politically charged field. Here, by political, not only do I mean geopolitics of the region, but also the politics of knowledge production, with references to a whole host of conceptual and theoretical assumptions. Her work is situated exactly at the fault line that allows her the possibility of writing a history without any ontological commitment to any temporality that is devoid of competing possibilities. In other words, both in her first book as well as her second book project, she writes about a historical moment in contingent terms without conceiving that moment as a link with a known past and a desired future. The historical event in her writing is perceived as a moment of possibility rather than moment of transition without a marked agentic significance or a moment of transition that reflects the unfolding of grand theories. In a sense, she is turning Lenin's famous dictum, or for some infamous dictum, from what is to be done without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement, on its head. Or maybe not on its head, but on its side. Carefully depicting the everydayness of revolutionary action and how it generates relationships, fields of revolutionary exercise, spatial contingencies, and temporal possibilities. I can imagine only a handful of scholars who are capable of carrying out this kind of historical ethnography. I don't want to go for too much longer, and I only have one wish before ending this introduction, that Mr. Mansour, my teacher, was here and could hear Naghmeh talk and read her writing to again realize how wrong he was about this binary understanding. And the screen is yours, Professor Sohrabi. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If you know me, you know that hearing these kind, generous words have rendered me a little speechless, but I'm often not speechless. Let me start by thanking Daniel Benjamin for his leadership of the Academy and for hosting all of us here. I will tell Behruz how touched and how appreciative I am both of his friendship and his mentorship, and tell the audience that don't believe everything you heard, but I take what he said as more of an aspirational commentary, and I hope to reach the great heights that he set for me in this intro. I also would like to thank everyone who's come. I don't know who you are, but a friend of mine the other day said that the audience is probably going to be like a mehmuni, which in Persian is a party, but not exactly a party. It's like a party where you have friends and acquaintances there, and everybody kind of knows each other and mingles. But I'm very appreciative of everyone who's come to hear me speak today, particularly Mr. Holtzbrink, and for his generosity in endowing my fellowship. I want to also thank my unnamed interlocutors and the people who I've interviewed over the years, and who many of them will not be hearing this. All of them will remain unnamed, but without whom I actually couldn't have done any of this project. Two more thanks, and then we will move on. I want to say a special thanks to the Academy administration, who made it possible for me to get here in many ways, in selecting me and making it possible for actually physically to get here, and especially the staff at the American Academy who've not only made it possible to live here, but to live here under a hard lockdown with joy and peace of mind. And particularly Caitlin, who just has been amazing in this whole thing. And I also want to thank my fellows at the Academy, the ones who are here, for their support, for their companionship, and for their amazing humor. So I want to begin, I'm going to give you, hopefully it'll be a short introduction, and then we'll move on to a conversation with Behruz, as was mentioned. But I want to begin by giving you a broad sense of my book, which, as Behruz pointed out, is tentatively called The Intimate Lives of a Revolution, Iran 1979. I began this project many moons ago by deciding to interview people who had experienced the 1979 revolution. I didn't quite know at the time, and at the time, let's just say is over 5 years ago, what I wanted to gain from these interviews. But I knew three things for sure. First, I knew that I wanted to interview people who were not famous at the time, but were just people who were part of this mass movement that toppled a seemingly stable and powerful monarchy. The second thing I knew was that I was not interested in oral history, in that I did not want my interviews to merely complement already available sources. What I wanted was for my interviews to shape the questions that I was going to ask. And the third thing I knew is that I wanted to create a way of using recollections and memories that neither disavowed the interviewees' remembrances, laced as they were with time and sometimes trauma, but nor did I want to take them at their word. In other words, I wanted to find a way of writing about the revolution that simultaneously believed my interviewees and was skeptical of what they were saying. These first principles, if you want to call them that, allowed me to focus on not only things that were unsaid, which is historians really love lacuna and things that were not said, but mainly what I was interested in was what was said, but was assumed to be known to me in the name of everyone. In other words, what was said, and to my interviewees, it was obvious. These were memories, events, repeated sentences, sentiments that in the interviews were not lingered over. There were moments that when I would ask the person to tell me more, they would often look at me quizzically and say, "Why is this interesting to you? Everybody knows this." Over time, I understood that in these instances in which my interviewees were not consciously stopping to explain something to me, and here lay the nuggets of their experiences that had remained outside the ravages of memory and the revisionism that accompanies remembrance, particularly that of experiences that carry elements of trauma, of shame, and of disavowal. So what had begun initially as a project about the 1979 revolution had morphed into the capturing of a generation's experiences. This generation is both my object of inquiry and my unit of analysis. Now, especially if you're a sociologist, you know there are debates about definitions of generation, particularly with Mannheim and all of that stuff, but I'm going to keep it simple. The definition of generation I'm going to use is a variation that was employed by R.F. Foster in the book Vivid Faces, which is a book about revolutionaries in Ireland at the turn of the century. And I don't know if Hussein is here, but thank you, Hussein, for introducing me to that book. Foster's definition of a generation is, quote, "A group or groups not necessarily made up of people born at the same time, who conceive of themselves as bonded together by cultural mentality and social circumstance," end of quote. So in my work, I take the obvious to the revolutionary generation experiences, but I use these as flashlights into existing archives and build a historical narrative around them. In some ways, I'm not really so much peeling the onion as placing a hodgepodge of peels from oranges and apples back onto it and remaking it. Now, one story that emerged almost continuously and very early on in my research, and often as an afterthought by my interviewees, was the story of a couple, I was told, that had fallen in love and then been killed by their comrades. In 2014, one person told me, quote, "There was even a case in Mashhad, which is a city in northeastern Iran, There was even a case in Mashhad where a girl and a boy, without informing their comrades, had engaged in a relationship, and the organization immediately upon finding out had killed the boy. I was told this type of story over and over again, almost always without names, with no dates, no faces attached to it. But what this story contained across the board was a singular mantra: love was forbidden, ishq mamnu. This mantra became a stand-in in the retellings for the folly of my interviewees' youth, for the errors of their ways, for a premonition of the failure of the left to dominate the revolutionary forces in the aftermath of the revolution. For the thinking goes among this generation who would tell me the story was, how could a movement that killed its own for love be capable of ushering in a liberal democratic era, which is a goal that my interviewees often retroactively believe the movement should have strived for. Sometime in early fall 2020, I began digging into the story more and was very lucky that a friend who I know is here, and thank you, you know who you are, asked their relative, and their relative gave me a name, Edna. Now, almost all the other details that this person gave was not exactly correct, but that name, Edna, unraveled the knot that I'd been picking at for some time. It turns out, once you know what you're looking for, there is a wealth of testimonies, memoirs, privately communicated memories, confessions, and other types of often ephemeral sources that together paint a picture of what happened. And I'm going to launch into that now. So the general outline of the story is as follows. Abdollah Panjehshahi and Edna Sabet were members of one of the two main guerrilla organizations that were formed in late 1960s in Iran. The organization they were a member of was called the Organization of Iranian People's Fadai Guerrillas, which I'm going to call Fadais from now on. Edna Sabet and Abdollah Panjehshahi, like many others of their generation, had become politicized in the university and had eventually gone underground, living in clandestine team houses. Edna came from a well-to-do Jewish family, though by all accounts, she did not identify herself as religious. And Abdollah also came from a middle-class family, though if you know Iran, if you know Iranian society, these terms are very inaccurate. His family lived in Narmak, for those of you who know the geography, and his father actually had a store in Fouzieh. Abdullah's mother actually very famously supported the Fadai cause. His parents' home was used as a shelter for his comrades, and his mother was referred to as mother, a term that in its lack of articles elevated her status in the organization. Young Iranians, much like their global counterparts, turned to armed struggle as a, if not the means to oppose the Pahlavi monarchy in the late 60s. As this younger generation of Iranian activists turned away from the Soviet Union towards Latin America and China and adopted the ideology, language, and behavior of armed struggle from revolutionary nodes in China, Latin America, Algeria, and Vietnam, Savak, Iran's security apparatus, grew more efficient and more brutal in its pursuit of them, systematically finding their cells, disbanding them, arresting those they could, killing those they could not. In the summer of 1976, Savak, who had been pursuing the leader of the organization, Hamid Ashraf, they've been pursuing him from team house to team house. I think he changed 14 team houses in 6 years. Savak finally caught up with him and killed him. Thus began the decimation of other clandestine team houses, primarily in Tehran. The small group of surviving guerrilla fighters found their way to a limited number of safe houses in provincial towns. In the case of Edna Sabet and Abdollah Panjehshahi, sometime in late 1976, they both ended up in a team house in the city of Isfahan. In the spring of 1977, according to the only eyewitness currently alive, Nahid Qajar, who was also residing in that team house, they were found together. What that together means is left a bit unclear, but what we are to understand it was a physical togetherness. And this caused a major crisis at the time that was already rife with fear and insecurity in the organization. When confronted, Abdollah Panjehshahi is said to have said they were in love. But sometime later, in late May or June of 1977, the ersatz leadership of the organization called Panjehshahi to Mashhad. He was never seen nor heard of again. While those responsible for purging him tried to keep a lid on it for a variety of reasons that I'm happy to get into in the Q&A, rumors immediately started in this small clandestine community of guerrilla fighters. Rumors that claimed that Panjehshahi had been killed for violating the notion that love was forbidden. So let me now go back to the question that I put in my abstract. Why did Iran's young leftist revolutionaries uphold this curious mantra? What does it mean that love was forbidden? Where did this come from? Why is it significant? But before I answer this, let me address the elephant in this Zoom room. The answer is not going to be Islam. And it's not going to be because Iran is a Muslim majority country or because this was in reality an Islamic revolution. To give that answer, we would both have to deny these revolutionaries their own understanding of their identity and political belief, i.e. their revolutionary secularism. And that's not something that I, as an historian, am ready to do. And the fact is we would not be entirely on solid empirical ground. To give you an example, there was a survey done of high school students in Tehran who were aged 15 to 19 on attitudes towards dating and mingling of members of the opposite sex. This survey was conducted in Iran, in Tehran in January of 1979, i.e. before the revolution. And the person who did the survey and then wrote a dissertation noted that, quote, no significant statistical difference was found between the parents' approval of their children's relationship with someone of the opposite sex and the degree of their religious beliefs. In other words, from uptown Tehran to downtown, from rich neighborhoods to poor, from religious families to non-religious ones, parents in 1970s Iran were not too keen on their kids having a relationship with a member of the opposite sex outside of a marriage framework, outside of a defined framework. As importantly, while this mantra of love is forbidden was known among those who identified as Islamic revolutionaries, it was an operating principle of primarily those who engaged in guerrilla warfare, both the secular Fada'is and the Islamic Marxist Mujahideen Khalq. Now, to give a historically accurate answer to the questions that I asked, we have to look in several places, and all of them could take up an entire talk, so I'm going to try not to do that. But I'm going to sort of focus, I'm just going to kind of gloss over four, in some ways, threads, if you want to call it, that woven together created the world in which this generation of Iranian revolutionaries existed and made sense of their struggle. The first one is the global framework for guerrilla struggle. So in his Socialism and Man, written in 1965, Che Guevara laid out what he saw was the price of revolution. As a side note, he himself did not pay this price, but he thought others should. He wrote, quote, our vanguard revolutionaries cannot descend with small doses of daily affection to the level where ordinary people put their love into practice. This sentence and the sentences around it problematize the idea of love, earthly, human, small, intimate, as an emotion that needed to be addressed and regulated by guerrilla fighters globally. From Brazil to Argentina to Uruguay's Tupamaros, and even the United States, movements for armed struggle at the very least had to contend with the place of love in a revolutionary movement. So in 1967, for example, Betita Martinez, who was a Chicana feminist in the United States, asked the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was involved in the civil rights movement at the time, and had begun to look to third world revolutionaries as a model for perhaps their own struggles. Betita Martinez asked in a series of texts that she wrote and was put together later on the following questions. Could you kill your mother? Or can you kill your father or mother as a Tom, a traitor to the revolution if ordered to do so? Could you work in a struggle which destroys your friends? These questions are no abstractions, not in this century. We are all facing bloody upheaval, if not swift annihilation. Armed struggle means discipline, and discipline means expediency. The second thread that I want to highlight is that to understand the story of Panjehshahi and Sabet and the power that it holds 50 years later, we need to understand what it means to join an armed struggle movement in 1970s Iran beyond just an intellectual history, of which there's, some would say too many, some would say enough. Few people would say not enough. The most important issue here is to truly get what it means to go clandestine in a team house. Team houses to urban guerrilla warfare were what the jungle and mountains were to rural guerrilla warfare, with these iconic photos of men and some women in their fatigues in the jungles, standing against their guns. The team house was what the jungle was. It camouflaged the fighters. Without them, the movement actually could not operate. These houses, and I've left Hamida Ashraf's team house to just give you a sense, were rented out in often populous neighborhoods, and in them 3 to 4 clandestine team members lived under fake names and identities. When they went underground, they cut off all contact with families and loved ones and devoted their lives fully and exclusively to the revolution. In theory, and often in practice, they led a regimented life that consisted of regular exercise, typing and printing of illegal pamphlets and declarations, forging of documents such as birth certificates, use and care of weapons, making of Molotov cocktails and bombs, surveillance of assassination targets or banks that they would rob in order to have funds, map making of the city, theoretical discussions about what is the correct path for the revolution, and at nights, taking shifts to guard the house. They lived on the small amount of money the organization would give each team house. Through choice and necessity, they ate simple meals, and because they needed to be on guard all the time, since the stakes were so high if they got discovered, they always kept their sneakers on and their guns on them. They made their own cyanide pills that they learned with fearful trepidation to keep planted in their gums in case they were captured. The best form of camouflage for urban guerrillas was to look and be like all the other houses around it. And this provided a challenge to movements such as the one in Iran, where almost all the participants were young and roughly the same age. For how can you set up house if you're all the same age and you are men and women? As such, there was only one camouflaging form available to them, and that was creating team houses that to the outside world consisted of a seemingly married couple, plus the spouse's brother or sister with uncles, and then uncles, aunts, and cousins who would visit them. These were called justified marriages, ازدواج توجیهی, for the fada'is, who merely acted as if the couple was married to the neighborhood, and ازدواج تشکیلاتی, or organizational marriages, for the mujahideen who married the couple in the team house so as to abide by their religious beliefs. The fact that these revolutionaries were of one generation, thus necessitating fake marriages in order to hide, meant that at the heart of the movement lay a major tension that needed to be articulated, if not solved: sexual and emotional intimacy. This problem of intimacy, I argue in my work, is not some side issue relegated to discussions of gender and sexuality. It's not something you need to know if you decide to write a gendered history of the Fada'is, for example. It lies at the heart of what it means to be an urban guerrilla fighter, and it shaped many practices in the team house. It also accounts for the massive reverberations that Panjehshahi and Sabet's story created. I call this idea decoy domesticity, a concept that existed globally in places that had urban guerrilla movements, but was then adapted locally to the environment it was embedded in. Unlike the jungles and mountains, team houses both define the space of politics for armed struggle quite literally by walling it in and hiding it, and was also defined by the socio-cultural world around it. In other words, decoy domesticity changed as the shape of domesticity changed from place to place. The third factor is the team house. The third factor that I want to lay out about the team house is that it had a porous relationship with the society it was hiding in. I can talk about this more. I'm very conscious of time and I want to sort of start debating Behruz, but let me just say that it's very important to keep in mind that in 1970s, Iran was awash in anxieties about marriage, even though divorce rate had dropped since the 1960s. And it also had a lot of anxiety about young women in the world, even though urban female unemployment had actually gone down. And I want to draw your attention to the slide here. This is from it's a 2-page spread on the left side in a popular and state-sanctioned weekly called Modern Woman, or Zanaruz. And it includes, and this is just one of many, 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 many articles in the 1970s, it includes an article written by a woman named Peri Sekandarani that warns parents of the dangers that await their children, primarily their daughters, when they are sent abroad to study. The article pleads with parents. Remember, we think of the Pahlavi state as this Western liberal place, and here is a journal that is put out by people sympathetic. They're definitely not in opposition to the state at the time. And it's an article that basically pleads with parents, please do not send your children to the West to study. Studying in the West could lead to the total deprivation of the child, she warns the parents. The West has unlimited freedom, including the freedom to watch sexual films and pornography, which, and I quote here, like dog poop, can be seen in every corner of the Western world. This social backdrop was the world in which these young men and women not only chose to cut off all relations with their families, but to lead a clandestine life in close quarters with each other. In describing her feelings about finding Panjehshahi and Sabet together in the team house, Nahida Qajar touches on these wider anxieties by saying, quote, as a woman, I thought, what if after all these great blows against the organization, the situation becomes such that there is no safety anymore for female comrades of the organization. And therefore, at any point, it becomes possible that they're abused. The last factor that I'll quickly go over and I can come to again was the way in which the security apparatus, which is the Savak, fed into these social anxieties and weaponized them against the revolutionaries themselves. Now, this is not a tactic that was specific to Iran. Other people have written about, for example, in the case of Argentina, similarly, it was the state security apparatus's demonization of the guerrilla fighters and the leftist fighters in particular as these morally depraved people that actually then influenced the way in which the organizations thought about questions of intimacy, sexual purity, and in general sexual relations between team members. In this particular case, for example, the article talks about how when they raided a team house and they killed some of the members in it, they found these 2 women in it who talked about how one of them was pregnant and she was forced to get an abortion, and how they had been bought jewels in order to be compliant with the needs of the men. And this is just one, again, of many. And you can figure out who was in that team house, and it's actually not quite correct. Let me end with 2 things. I wanted to talk about the stakes of a project like this, although I feel Behruz had done a much better job than I would have in laying out the stakes. But I want to talk about the stakes of a project that focuses on a generation and uses that as a lens to think about issues such as love and intimacy, and why this is crucial to understanding the 1979 revolution. And the idea that I just want to raise, and it's something I have just begun thinking about myself, so I'm happy to think out loud with everybody else, was raised by my friend and Academy Fellow, Alice Goff. Now, far too often in our teleological readings of the revolution, i.e. starting from the Islamic Republic and moving backwards, we tend to collapse the idea of the moral with the political. And Alice pointed this out to me when she read the chapter saying, you know, can we think about these 2 things in terms of the relationship with each other? I think by unpacking a story like Panjehshahi and Sabet's and placing intimacy at the heart of armed struggle, it forces us actually to rethink our assumptions about the relationship between the moral and the political sphere. And it raises the question, to quote Alice, as to what the contours of society were outside of state and religion, the latter 2 of which have become almost the sole focus of post-revolutionary historiography. Now I'm going to end with Edna Sabet's fate, because we know what happened to Panjehshahi. Perhaps Unsurprisingly, Edna Sabet, the woman, was not killed by her comrades. There are various narratives of what happened to her after Panjehshahi's death that differ primarily in their details. What we do know is that she remained clandestine until the revolution, when, like many of her comrades, she reemerged and reconnected with her family. Sometime in 1978, she renounced armed struggle, left the Fadai organization, and joined the Organization of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, known as PECOD. And she got married to Aruni, Ghulam Hossein Aruni. When a brutal crackdown began by the Islamic Republic on dissident groups and organizations, many of whom had been part of the Revolutionary Alliance, Edna and her husband were arrested. This was in 1982. She is believed to have been tortured in post-revolutionary Iran and executed later in 1982. Now, those who knew her in the years after Panjehshahi's death say she never spoke a word about him. But in her written confessions from her post-revolutionary interrogations, she is said to have said the following, quote, "I have put behind me a long stormy period, which is the hardest in my life. On the one hand, I knew the Fadais to be revolutionaries, and I had faith in their revolutionary honesty, especially toward the lower masses. And for this reason, I had a strong emotional attachment to the organization. On the other hand, there were a series of events I neither wanted nor could close my eyes to these social realities. These realities compelled me to believe that the direction the guerrillas had taken was wrong. These were the closest she ever got to leaving a record of her experience of those tumultuous years." Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. Yeah. So there are, I'm sure, I don't want to take up too much of the time having a conversation between the two of us, because I already see many questions coming in, and I want to sort of have a good amount of time to address those questions. But one very important point that you mentioned, and you passed a little bit quickly on that, and I wanted to go back to it, sort of a methodological question. And when you said that you were discussing, and these are the unsaid in the conversation, and the way that they were surprised that how come you don't know these things, and in a sense, it's an important kind of phenomenological approach to what the American sociologist Harold Garfinkel says, the seen but unnoticed,
Mhm.
and and everybody sees it, but nobody notices it until somebody comes in as a stranger and says, "So what about this?" And of course, in that American tradition, this is the way they argue that you see the structures within which any kind of action is articulated and lived. So I want you to talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's a important part of your research, and the way those three elements that you mentioned, that you don't want to collect oral history, you don't want to listen to their narratives for the sake of the narrative, but in order to create a rupture in the narrative, in order to disrupt it as an outsider, and force another different kind of conversation there. So if you don't mind, just unpack a little bit that sort of methodological intervention there.
Sure. I feel you've done a fantastic job of formulating it, and I'm going to have to steal those formulations from you later. So I'm just going to put it in a bit more kind of workhorsey kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
My running joke, which is not really a joke, is that, I know I'd succeeded if somebody from the revolutionary generation picks up my book, reads the book, and says, I knew all of this.
Mm-hmm.
I say that because in some ways, that is exactly what I'm interested in capturing. But the idea is a little bit more than that. It's not just capturing the things that the generation knows about, but it's my way of kind of getting around the memory problem. And it is a real memory problem, right? I mean, I don't need to tell you this, but just for the general audience, I mean, first of all, because I can't go to Iran, I've had to deal with a very particular subset of former revolutionaries, which is the revolutionaries that landed outside of Iran. And while I've tried to do creative ways of talking to people who are, for example, in Iranian government, or Skyping with people who are inside of Iran, and therefore their lives have not been kind of broken into pre-diaspora and post-diaspora, if you want to call it that, and therefore have a more of a continuity of experiences between the revolution and the post-revolutionary period, you know, the majority of the people I talk to are kind of remembering the past through that lens. There's also just the fact that, you know, you're older, and I mean, I barely remember what I ate yesterday, let alone remember what it felt like to be a revolutionary. I was 6, but still I was a revolutionary in my heart. But I say all of this is that what I wanted to do is figure out where is that untouched memory, the one that exists, but because it's not constantly being recalled and reformulated and retold, can sort of sit there and contain more than just the post-revolutionary period itself. And it was precisely in the things that you mentioned, right? It's precisely in what I call the obvious. And I think it sits there. You know, I read a really interesting article once about how memory works. And the idea was that physically, every time you recall a memory and you remember it, and then you tell it, that memory changes and actually resides in a different part of your brain. And I wanted to capture the memories that are not moving up and down and moving around in the brain. And it was that. But there was another reason why I wanted to focus on the obvious, which is that it's there in the obvious resides in the archive, right? The story of Panjehshahi, the idea of love, books and pamphlets, which, as you know, is something I'm really interested in. These all reside in the archives, but the questions we're asking of the archives don't let us see that material, because the questions that we're asking are very much post-revolutionary questions. And I was interested in saying, what did the 70s look like if I didn't know that 1979 was going to happen? Right? How would I read the newspaper? How would I read a pamphlet that was handed to me? And I felt that using this idea of the obvious, these objects in which is just almost taken for granted, allowed me at least to ask the kind of questions that would open up other aspects of the archive. And the last thing I'll say about this is that what I was interested in is more often than not stories that went across the political spectrum. Because the post-revolutionary historiography, as I've written before and we've talked about a lot, you know, has created these categories that are not categories of their own time, which is the Islamists were operating in a completely different sphere. It's like they were not even in the same society. The secularists, the leftists, the religious nationalists. And this is why I'm really taken by Alice's suggestion of thinking about morality and politics and how they relate together, and being conscious of the fact that they relate to each other in a different way in the 1970s than they did in the post-revolutionary period. And again, obvious, these things that everybody talks in kitchen sink conversations becomes a way of actually reconstituting, right, morality, a moral sphere, a political sphere, in which you call society outside of these categories. It was long-winded, but you got me super excited.
No, that's a very obviously important question, and it opens up many different possibilities. You know, that famous example that you know, you never think about the doorknob unless the doorknob is not working. You know, so this is the doorknob that suddenly you are sort of thinking that what if that doorknob doesn't work? You know. Yeah. What kind of questions does it generate? I want also to say that I mean, this is sort of more of an anecdote and not necessarily a question. A lot of these sensibilities, of course, continues after the revolution, and And I don't know whether there is an archive of these confessions inside Evin and Ghazal Asar prison. And at some point, since Dan already mentioned this about me, I remember that in Ghazal Asar prison, when they ask prisoners to come and confess, and announce that they recant and this and that, and there was a ritual there. You say that I am such and such, and I was a member of this group, and I did all these crimes and blah blah blah. It was very scripted. And at some point, the warden, chief warden, Ghazal Asar, a person named Haj Dawood, he always interrupted people when they said that, okay, I am Joe Schmo, and I was a member of Fadayan, and we believed. And he said, no, we are not interested in what you believe. Just tell us what was happening on those team houses, like, and it became such a kind of to a certain degree, a very pornographic kind of ritual that exclusively the interest was exactly that how that kind of sexual, erotic love, all these things together, how they played out in these team houses, and that was the main concern that they wanted to. So, but it just was a sort of an interesting kind of continuity there, that is a reflection of that question of morality, I think.
Yeah, and I would say that there's so much to say about just your anecdote, but I will just tack on to it that the other place in which you can use this to think about continuity, of course, is to rethink about the early, very early post-revolutionary years and ask yourself, how did it slowly encroach, right? Mm-hmm. This shift in political moral spheres that the Islamic Republic was trying to forge. And I think, as controversial as it may be to say this, I think one answer is because the elements already existed in the pre-revolutionary period, right? These ideas, something simple that every Fada'i that I talk to knows, and also the Mujahids, they talk about the team houses, women not putting on makeup, trying to demasculinize themselves. Ala Ahmad's Gharb Zadegi, this idea of Arusak Farangi, all of these, they're little pieces, but they all come together in that post-revolutionary period to make this new world order that the Islamic Republic was trying to create not alien. I won't say palatable, but it has enough in common in the vocabulary of the pre-revolutionary struggle that it can actually be pushed forward just a little bit.
Yes.
And I see that also as another line of the continuity between the revolution and the post-revolutionary.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll go to questions from the audience. This is an interesting kind of question of memory, and you very consciously decide not to engage with this line of inquiry when, like, one of your interlocutors say that we were struggling for a liberal democracy, or I had this conversation a while ago with a very good friend of mine, and she was saying that at least we were struggling for proletarian democracy. Whether I said, well, actually we were struggling for proletarian dictatorship, not democracy, and I always thought that. So where is the place of engagement for this kind of, like, these kind of shots of memory that sort of comes out of this frame, that it's, I don't know, I mean, it's sort of like, how do people see themselves in that context and then retell that story in a very kind of coherent and continuous form of narrative, and that's a sort of a very interesting curiosity to me. But I know that you don't engage that much with that question in your work, or if you do, how you do it, And if you don't, why don't you think that's an interesting kind of part of that whole conversation?
The disavowal or the coherence?
The disavowal.
You know,
I mean, both of them. I mean, disavowal and the
I'll
coherence.
give you a flippant answer first, which is not flippant. There's real, which is, I feel like the Iranian Revolution deserves one space in which one person is not judging everybody.
Yeah.
And I want that space to be me. I mean, and that's, it's a flippant way of putting it, but I feel like, you know, I want to know before I can sit down and say, you are disavowing, you are not, this is, you know, this is what you did and this is what you did. I mean, maybe other people know more than I do and feel comfortable to reach that stage of analysis, but to me, it's a political act to not do that. To me, it's a political act to say, yes, I know you are lying to me. You know, and I'll give you the example that I'd love to give every time somebody asks me a question about disavowal is a time that, you know, I spent many sessions and hours talking to somebody about his memories, and he's currently a monarchist. He was not a monarchist at the time, and he constantly would tell me these stories and constantly tell me, but I took no part in the revolution because I was against it. I took no part, I was against it. And then when I asked him for photos, there he was in the street holding a photo of Khomeini himself in the photo that he was showing me. What do I gain by pointing out to him? I mean, I really genuinely don't know what I gain. I know he was there. He knows that I can see he was there. What's more interesting to me is what he chooses to tell me while telling me he wasn't there. Because in telling me he wasn't there, he felt then comfortable enough to tell me very intimate things about his life that I don't, and I know for a fact he wouldn't have told me if I had been sitting there saying, wait, this doesn't make any sense. Why are you denying that you were? So I feel like for what I'm interested in, which is not how the generation analyzes its own role or for how the generation analyzes the revolution. What I'm interested in is how that generation lived it. For that, in fact, not pushing back against the disavowal is what gives me what I need and gives them the space to be what I need them to be.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I really don't think that this is a position of judgment. I mean, I'm more interested in how these narratives are constructed, that coherence comes together, you know, that really not about the judgment and anything like that. But let me go to some of the questions. I mean, this is a very important question that I thought that, you know, somebody would ask this question, that what is love? How do you define love?
I don't define love. You know? And I don't see why I would need to define love. I use the term love in places in which the person speaking to me uses the word ishq. I use it where the document that I'm reading or the memoir that I'm reading refers to it as ishq or dust dashtan. But it's not so much, I understand why in the project conceived of differently, you would need to sit down and say, you know, what were the conceptions of love among the revolutionary generation? And that's a really interesting question. It actually is a very interesting question. And I think there's very much room for that. What I'm interested in is what we can understand about the experience if we look at, let's say, the guerrilla movement through the lens of intimacy, right? How do we understand its practices? How do we understand its organization, right? So the story becomes an entryway into a different kind of historical analysis. I can't say that, you know, and I'm sorry, I know Farzan Amir, I think Farzan Amirani asked that question. So hi, thank you for asking this question. But I cannot define it for you, and perhaps I should have sat down and thought about it. It just didn't seem necessary for the analytical work that I was doing. What I do want to say is I do think about the continuity of the notion of love, not the notion of love, but the practice of paying a price for the revolution through love. I think about that continuity, of course, between the Tudeh generation and the Fada'i generation, which is the earlier communists, and the Fada'is through the poem of Ebtehaj Galia. which every Fadai in the world knows most of that poem by heart. And it was a poem that was written in 1953. And that poem does use the word ishq in it. And can I read it? Is that okay?
Please do read. I was going to ask you to read it because that's an important, part of the conversation.
I'm not going to read the whole poem. It's a long poem, and I apologize for the translation. I'm not poetically inclined, but I translated it. So the poem is called Galia. It was written in 1953. And if you actually look for it in Persian, it pops up on Fadai sites, which is, over 2 decades. I mean, now much 60 or 70 years later, it's still being claimed as a poem that speaks to the armed struggle movement, even though it came out of the communist movement of an earlier era. And the poem says, parts of it, Galia, it's too late. Do not sing fairy tales of love in my ear. No longer ask of me songs of rebellion. Galia, it's late. The caravan has left. A love of yours and mine, sigh, what a story. But in these times when everyone despairs to put food on the table, there is no room for love and stories. It's too late, Galia. There is no time for kisses and poems of love. Everything is the color of blood and fire these days. It is the uproar of the liberation of lips and hands, the revolt of life. And that's just because Farzan and Milan is here, and I felt I had to read a poem.
Of course. No, this was important. I think that for the way you are framing your own work, perhaps the question of intimacy is the central element of this conversation in terms of love. I mean, it's about intimacy, and which brings in questions of love, sexuality, erotic connection, all those things that all together in these teamy houses. So we have a question about how do you see Peyman Vahabzade's story of Edna and Panjehshahi, the way he narrates it in his book.
Peyman's, I mean, first of all, Peyman has done amazing work for particularly the guerrilla movement, and his book is a history of all of it. And so when I say he spends a paragraph or maybe two, it's not a critique. It's that you can't tell this entire history and then spend as much time as I am spending on the story. But what he basically does, and he uses a bunch of sources that I had looked into also, the way the story came out in academia, so it was known among the community, but in the 90s, Maziar Behruz, who's a scholar of Iran, wrote a book called Rebels with a Cause. And in it, he went to the oral history archives at Harvard and found, so there's an interview there by a guy named, I think, Mahfouzi, if I'm not mistaken. In it, he says, yeah, at the time I heard this guy Panjehshahi had been killed. And Mahfouzi talks about how he actually had spent time with Panjehshahi's mother, and how her ideas and words had turned him away from philosophy, which was what he was interested in, and brought him into politics. And in it, he talks about how this guy named Panjehshahi had been purged. So Behruz writes that, Maziar Behruz writes that, and then it explodes within the Persian-speaking leftist community. So it's a very interesting world in that the Persian-speaking leftist community, the former revolutionaries read some of the scholarship that is coming out of North America and Europe. We rarely read them and take them seriously, but they take it very seriously. And they devoted multiple issues of different magazines to it. So in it, what happened was, which I found really interesting, was that supposedly it was a trio of people that decided to kill Panjehshahi, and two of them are no longer alive. One of them is. That person wrote about the Behruz thing, that this was not an ideological purge. And it becomes very important for some of the former revolutionaries to say this was not an ideological purge, because if it was an ideological purge, it meant that the organization was ideologically closed-minded, right? If you say it was for love, you can say, well, humans are fallible. It was a very heinous act, but that had to do with, you know, male notions of sex and intimacy and all of that. I say all of that as it connects to Peymon, because Peymon's book, if I'm not mistaken, I could be I'm pretty sure I'm not, sort of brings up Mazir Behrouz's writing about it, but actually names Edna, and Edna is not named in Mazir Behrouz's book, and says that Panjehshahi was in a relationship with a woman named Edna, and he then opens the door for that interpretation to exist in English scholarly references. But it's a paragraph, if I'm not mistaken. No.
Yeah, that's true. There were a couple of questions about your again interlocutors who were very active during the revolution, and you talked a little bit about this. But since there are a couple of questions about this, how many of them actually remain political, and how many? I mean, does it matter to you that what kind of life they have now? Are they still sort of politically active, and that's how they remember the past, or they have sort of locked the past in a box and went on to a different kind of life? If you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, it matters to me what they're doing now, because as Behrouz said early on, I'm not exactly doing ethnography, but I'm using ethnography in order to get past all the different obstacles that lie in using materials that are like the materials that I use. And one of that, what you learn when you learn ethnography, which I had to learn, is that you kind of look at the whole web of where the words are coming from and the story is being told is embedded in a social cultural network of meanings, and you kind of try to tease out the meaning of the words by looking at that entirety. And so where they are today, what they are doing matters to me, because it helps me do what I had said was my number 3 principle, which is simultaneously believe and be skeptical. I can do that if I can understand where they're coming from today and how that has shaped actually the narrative that they're giving me. As a side note, it's a generalization that is like empirically true almost for every single person, except 1 or 2 people that I talk to, which is a lot of the women that I talk to have gone through therapy and are now understand those experiences and articulate them with an emotional remove that some of the others that I talk to don't have. You know, this is a very dime store idea of trauma, but a not very academic, not very, specific idea of trauma is that trauma collapses the past, the present, and the future. And that actually is a very interesting idea that I have to take into consideration when I'm thinking about my interviews and I'm talking to them, because no matter what they are doing, for some people, they are politically active, some people are not politically active. If they experience their leaving of Iran, not the revolution necessarily, their leaving of Iran as a traumatic moment in their own lives, that actually shortens the way in which they think about time. So when they're talking about memories of 1975, they are experiencing it as if the stakes of 75 are still there today. And just to give you a small example, some of the people, for example, wouldn't talk to me in a cafe, right? And I would say, okay, I mean, that's fine. I'll speak to you wherever you need to, but why? And it would be like, you don't know who's listening, right? These are 75, sometimes 80-year-old men who are not politically, I hate to put it this way, and I don't want to demeaning them, but I'm just saying, like, what they tell me is not going to have real life consequences, neither for them nor for the world. But that's not how they are experiencing that moment, right? Some of them would put me through tests before they would talk to me. So it's not so much whether they're politically active or not right now is an important distinction. But for me, the more interesting distinction that mattered more in my analysis was how do they think about, how do they experience the past that they are talking to me about?
Very good. We have a question about, since you mentioned you read that amazing passage from Zanaruz, are there studies of intimacy, sexual relations among Iranian youth in the 1960s and 70s outside these journalistic writings? Are there serious kind of scholarly engagement with that issue? Do you know any of those?
I've looked a lot at dissertations. I quoted one dissertation. So there are some, but not in the way that I was thinking about that I needed for my work. So the dissertation that quoted about the youth attitudes was actually a dissertation that was looking at attitudes of Iranian youths towards dating and sex based on how much American television they watch. That was the question of the dissertation. But the nice thing is that the person who wrote the dissertation just published all of her findings, all of her surveys, and so she left behind, granted, her sample is like 270 people. It's not very big and it's based in Tehran, but it is something that gives you a snapshot out of that. But the way in which I was looking at the question of intimacy and sexual relations, there is some, and the ones that I found is in dissertation format, but nothing. And if what I'm saying, you're thinking to yourself, oh no, you're missing out, please email me the title. I beg you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and CC that to me too. So if while you're at
it.
And another question, which is also, I think, quite an important sort of part of the conversation. You talked about differences in class and lack of differences in class attitude toward, extramarital sex and relationship with youth. What about religion? Is like non-Muslims were looked at differently, or did they look at themselves differently? And I know that you mentioned that Edna really didn't, operated based on this kind of identification with the Jewish heritage or religion, but how about, is there a way to sort of have access to know like how others viewed people who were not Muslims but were part of Muslim and they were part of the movement? Because indeed we have so many active participation of non-Muslims in revolutionary movements in Iran throughout history. So do you think, or have you sort of looked into this issue of differences in religious identification or not?
So I noted in my interviewees, and I don't need to reinvent the wheel. Lior Sternfeld, for example, has written an entire book on Jews in 20th century Iran and has a whole chapter devoted to Jewish participation in the revolution. As far as I haven't seen the equivalent of Lior's book for Armenian Christians or Christians in Iran. I don't know if you have seen it, Behruz. But again, this comes down to the people I speak to. I take them somewhat at their word when they identify themselves to me. So I have spoken to a number of non-Muslim activists. And I note that, and I think about what that means, especially because a lot of the questions that I ask is about their childhood, right? The first question I ask all my interviews, actually, beside how old are you and, your city of birth, one of the first questions I ask every single one is, how did you become politicized? And the story of becoming politicized for almost all of them starts in young adulthood, right? Some of them like to say I was politicized when I was 6, and I know that, and I don't laugh out loud. I'm just like, cool. But so
by watching Sesame Street, you can become. But I think the question was more of, at least the way I understand the question is more about the idea of intimacy, not in the very fact of participation, but how that idea of or relationship and intimacy worked out with reference to religious identity or identification.
I see. So it's an interesting question. So here's one of the things that I actually wrote down, but it didn't say, which is even the most virulently anti-Islamic Republic, secular people that I have interviewed who have told me this story have actually never said, and that's because of Islam. The ones who find the Islamic Republic responsible for everything, the ones who find religion to be backwards, all of these never have told me the story of Edna and Panjehshahi or whatever version they have told me and said, and this happened because of religion. And in fact, the person that I started this talk with in 2014, who was the first person who was like, yeah, there was this couple and then they were in Mashhad and the guy was killed. Later on in that interview, he tells this wonderful story where he says, you know, he was a pay cuddy also. And he says, I go to Paris and there's some kind of fête de l'humanité or something that he said it was a communist party. And there were scantily clad women and there was like an anarchist atmosphere. And he had just gotten there and he turned to his friend who was a comrade and says to him, I have more in common with the Shias in Iran right now than I do with this communist party. And this was someone who had devoted actually his entire teens and 20s. And I say that because it is a factor. It is important. It is important in the way in which these ideas are woven into the societal part of the story that I'm telling. And it's important because there's a porousness between these political activities and the society in which they're embedded, but it is not often named by the people who tell the story as the factor that is an explanatory factor for it.
And you know, you mentioned that the everyday life in Team House was basically an kind of constant call to arms. You know, you're always prepared, you're always dressed, you're always having your sneakers on, your cyanide ready, your gun there, and then we have the story of Edna and Panjehshahi, you know, and so how did that happen? I mean, they're violating. And this is one of the questions. I mean, I'm not making this up. Are they violating the protocol? And of course, you know, this is, I mean, we had this conversation before that it's basically limitation that is imposed upon them by this kind of generational issue that, are they violating the protocol, or there's, I mean, is there a different story there that we don't know that about this relationship? Or, you know, this is simply they're violating the protocol and putting others at risk. So how do we sort of retell this story? Is there possibly another version of that story, considering that there are, you know, people who are in that kind of circumstance always ready? And then how do we make sense of it if the story, the narrative, the story that you tell is actually what happened? They were having relationships and so on.
No,
and so forth.
but I'm glad. Thank you for whoever raised that. So yes. Okay, so first let's start with the sources, which is oral, right? So there are people who have told me the sources. But in terms of first person and eyewitnesses, there was one person and she's written it, and I have not spoken to her. I don't usually talk about who I've spoken to, but I did not speak to her. But here's what we do know in terms of the breaking of protocols. Protocol number one, the identities of the people, your real identities, were not supposed to be known to each other. So you were not supposed to know each other's real names, right? You were not supposed to know. This doesn't mean that it didn't happen, right? You are talking about young people who are basically living in kind of a pressure cooker, if you want to put it. In the post-76, that pressure cooker becomes the pressure cooker of all pressure cookers. So people violate these protocols. But in the case of Panjehshahi and Sabet, it was almost a perfect storm of violation of protocols, right? First of all, you're not supposed to know each other. But what happens is that in the spring of 1977, basically, it's a very long story. The short version is that two of Panjehshahi's sisters are killed in his parents' home. So his parents' home is raided. And it's raided because one of their comrades basically led the Sabak unknowingly to his parents' home. And what happens is that two of his sisters, who were not necessarily political, they were definitely not clandestine, are killed along with this comrade and another comrade. And then his mother and his two brothers have to go on the run. And nobody knows, and he doesn't know what has happened to him. And that, according to Nahid Qajar, sets off a chain of events, right? Where he is saying, why did they break the protocol? But because he is saying that and he is angry, that means people in his team house know what his identity is, right? And they weren't supposed to know that. It's also at a time in which, after what is called Zarbe Panjo Panj, or the blow of 76, which is the killing of Ashraf, and then this just kind of wiping out systematically of team house after team house, a debate. I mean, some people say that this argument started actually before 76, but it really takes off after 76, which is, do we need to renounce armed struggle? The rumor is, and I have zero evidence, I have heard from various people that Panjehshahi was like, maybe he was considering it. He was not part of the Munshayabin at all, but perhaps one can, and this is all speculation, a series of events, including the killing of his sister and the underground of his mother, may have either before led him to it and then afterwards really leading him to think. So there's that. Then, of course, there's this, them being found and lying together in each other's arms, let's put it that way, which is the terms that is used, which is a violation on top of a violation, is an on top of a violation, right? So what explains the decision to kill him? We're never gonna know, right? The one person who's alive says, I wasn't there, won't say anything. We're never ever going to know, but we do know that the leading up to this moment, a lot of different protocols in that team house were broken, and possibly in other team houses too. So the whole kind of the thread of this idea of the team house is almost falling apart.
Right. But these are issues that there are a number of questions, because we're running out of time, but there are a number of questions all about, the consequences that what you refer to as a generational problem, that if they're arrested under pressure in prison, then they're more vulnerable if they have emotional attachment to someone else. They're operating as a family and with care, with love, and then all these things, of course, they're part of that conversation. That I think that's a very, very important part of your intervention here, that the generational space that necessitated a series of relationships, construction of series of spaces that were in one way or another inevitable, and there was no way around it. But we also talk about these are, if I may use that terminology, like the positive caring emotions. There are also the other side of it, which is at least one of the versions I've heard of this assassination: jealousy, and competition, ambition, organizational ambition. So these are also, these are also things that had to be worked out in these team houses, right? And played a role in so many different ways in the way the organization operated.
No, you're absolutely right. But what I would point out too is that 50 somewhat years later, I have yet to meet someone who's like, and you know what? Jealousy is bad. And it's connected to the story of the guy that was killed in Mashhad. It's always told around Ishq Mamnu. And I'm not saying that's why he was killed, but I'm saying that is my entryway, right, into this larger story. But you're absolutely right. People talk about, I mean, you want to take it further in terms of what is being said amongst a lot of the revolutionaries of the Fadais themselves, is that the person who supposedly pulled the trigger was known to be, aggressive. Some people say that he's being thrown under the bus by the organization, by these rumors. I mean, there's a reason why I'm not naming these people, right? Because
no, we don't want you to name.
Yeah, I don't name these people, even though their names are public, because yeah, on a human level, we all want to know what happened. What I do know is that all these years later, the story keeps getting repeated as an example of love is forbidden, not as an example of don't have ambitions in an organization, or, you know, don't kill the person you want to replace if you find them having sex, right?
And again, there are so many important questions that I just think that we are running out of time, and I
suddenly appeared.
I know, you know, and I think that although with apologies to those who raised questions and we didn't have time to respond to them, or I couldn't raise those questions and submit them to Naghmeh. You can send your questions. I'm speaking on behalf of Naghmeh here. Send your questions to Naghmeh directly, and this was such a fascinating conversation, and thank you so much, Naghmeh and American Academy. I see Dan appeared there as you know, and so. How do we wrap up? This is the wrapping up.
Can I just say a thank you before you wrap?
Yes, of course.
I want to thank Behruz. These were fantastic questions, and to the audience for asking a lot of questions. So thank you so much. And as Behruz said, feel free to send me an email, and I will answer your emails. I'm good about that.
She doesn't answer my emails, but that's okay.
I didn't just appear. I've been here the whole time. I just didn't have my camera on. I'm delighted to be back, though. And that was a completely fascinating talk and a insight into this extraordinary act of historical reconstruction and interrogation of all the vagaries of memory. And it's just fascinating. At the risk of using a hackneyed analogy, I feel like I'm listening a little bit to a modern Iranian Rashomon, because there's so many interesting stories within the stories. So anyway, we look forward to the further development of this narrative. I want to thank Behruz for his terrific moderation and all of his insights and his questions. And I want to thank Naghmeh for a remarkable presentation. I look forward to hearing more about this as our term continues. I want to thank the audience again for coming. I hope you were as entranced as I was. And I just want to say in closing that our next event will be the Anna Maria Kellen Lecture, and it is entitled James Baldwin, The Making of an American Icon. That will take place on Tuesday, March 2, which is actually not very far off. And it will be delivered by the Harvard scholar Robert Farr Reed. Robert Farr Reed. So he will discuss the talk. He will discuss Baldwin in a talk moderated by Frank Kelleter, who is chairs the Department of Culture at the Freie Universität here in Berlin. Anyway, at this point, I'm stumbling over my words. So it is definitely time to say goodnight, and again, to thank our speaker and our moderator and all of you who have participated. So I hope you have a very good evening, afternoon, whatever it is, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Behruz Jun.